resentment isn't just having a grievance. We often use it loosely. He's resentful about what happened. So we think about resentment sometimes in a very simplistic term. It's actually a very complex emotional state because it is a feeling that you've been mistreated in the past, you've been subjected to injustice, to humiliation, etc. But the second part is that at the time you did not respond. You did not stand up for yourself. You did not argue back. You just let the injustice occur without protesting. You let the humiliation occur without any effective response to that humiliation. And that's where the ongoing bitterness and the ongoing true resentment continues, because you keep reliving these experiences in your imagination, in your memory. They become a dominant theme, not just how I've been mistreated, but why did I not actually stand up for myself? So the next thing you see about these killings, and it makes perfect sense if you think about it, it is striking back at the world, and it is saying, I am not a weak wimp. I am a man of power.
Welcome to the Targeted Violence Podcast, which is brought to you by our sponsor, Groundproof Forensic Institute. Groundproof provides specialist training in forensic psychology, behavioural science and law enforcement practice, and training is delivered by those with frontline and operational experience. For more information, visit groundproofforensics.com. Now, in today's show, I'm delighted to be joined by forensic psychiatrist Paul Mullen. Paul is an Emeritus Professor at Monash University and an internationally recognised forensic psychiatrist for his work on fixations, threats, stalking and violence. In addition to his academic work, he's consulted on numerous high-profile cases providing psychiatric assessments of perpetrators. Paul, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here. Now, we've got lots we could talk about today. You've had a very illustrious career. And recently you've channeled some of your work into a new book, Running Amok, which we're going to talk about, and also your experience across Australia, New Zealand, and also internationally in working with and assessing some of these perpetrators, including Martin Bryant, which we'll talk about today. Your work with the Fixated Research Group, which has really pioneered the fixated threat assessment practices that are around currently. So there's a lot that we're going to cover today, and I am really excited to talk to you about it all.
Good. Let's start then.
Wonderful. Should we start off by talking about your new book? And before we jump into looking at some of your, I guess, historical work, talk about your current work, which you've just published, Running Amok, Inside the Mind of the Lone Mass Killer.
Yeah.
What motivated you to write the book?
Well, really, the book is a set of stories. It's stories about men, all men, who take a gun and go out into a public area, shoot as many people as they can, and expect to die there among their victims. It's a very strange form of crime if you think about it. And what I've done is collect the stories of the people that I've seen in detail, some of whom I've seen over many years, and put together some of the better documented cases from America, from the UK, and in particular from Norway. So it's a book of stories, and stories, I think, that tell us a great deal about what is a very strange and, oddly enough, a very new form of criminal activity within Western societies. The reason the book's called Running Amok is that we learned about the phenomena, very similar phenomena, in Malaysia and other parts of the East in the 18th and 19th centuries. And they're very similar, but they've never occurred in Britain, never occurred in Europe, never occurred in America, Canada, or any English-speaking world. The first time anyone ran amok in the Western world was 1910. A middle-aged headmaster from Stuttgart. But after that, there were hardly any until 1966, when the Texas University Tower Massacre occurred. And that is what set the pattern, which provided, if you like, the script which began to be followed. At first, occasional people, usually acknowledging the Texas University killer as their inspiration, but it was 1 or 2 a year. And then it started to become 2 or 3 a year, then 10 a year, then 20 a year, then 100 a year, and now we're pushing towards 1,000 a year. So that we've got a modern epidemic.
It is alarming, as you're saying, isn't it? Just the rates and the prevalences now.
Yep, it just keeps going up. There's been a slight drop back this year, but I don't think it'll be for long. It'll be up and running again. But I think when you look at these stories, which I tell in the book, you begin to see what is in common with all of they have many things, many differences. There are many reasons why one might not think of them as similar sort of crimes. But in fact, when you get down to tell their stories, there are common features which run through virtually all of these mass killings.
Yeah, I found it really interesting looking at your book last night, how you've tracked and charted the history of mass killings, and we can see how it definitely across Western society it has risen significantly in the last few decades. And previously, it really wasn't a phenomenon, but now, as you say, it is an epidemic. Do you look at that in terms of more so localized in Australia and New Zealand, or are you very much on an international landscape that you
Well,
are looking at it?
it's definitely on an international scale.
Mm,
One could have written something entirely about Australia and New Zealand, which is very interesting, because Australia and New Zealand have a somewhat different history. Yes, it took off in Australia and New Zealand, really 80s, 90s, but it was the 80s, early 90s, which were when it started to really take off. And it took off more here in Australasia than anywhere else. There was a
mm.
point when there were more of these killings occurring in Australasia per head of population than America. So we had a very rapid run in here. And then it's dropped away. And the why it's dropped away, of course, is an important part of the story in the book.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously in New Zealand, as you talk about in your book, when you were living there, you had the mass shooting at Aramoa.
Aramoana.
Aramoana, where 13 people were killed, and you were living in that community at the time. And then, of course, I think you had moved over to Australia, and shortly after that in 1996 was the Port Arthur Massacre.
That's right.
So,
Yes, the first experience I had of it was, being very close to where it occurred. We lived along Harbourside, and the road that ran down the bottom of our road uh, finished up at Aramoana, and we could hear the gunfire. And,
mm,
and it was clear that you did hear gunfire. You heard people letting go, not infrequently shooting rabbits with 2.2s. Occasionally, people shooting off larger weapons, 303s and things like that. God knows what that. Perhaps
yeah.
very large bunnies. I don't know. But this was different. I mean, you could immediately recognise that this was semi-automatic fire coming in burst by burst, and then over the next couple of hours, it was clear that something dreadful was happening. I began to get in touch. I got in touch with the hospital and began to learn what was happening.
Mm, mm,
I mean, it gets close when people you work with, people you know, the parents of people, well, your children, the parents of the children, your children went to school with, caught up, and one of my patients was caught up at the very centre of it. So it was a very different experience to start off, as it were, not as an external observer, but as
yeah.
a marginal, very marginal victim in a sense.
Yeah, you really were part of that community tragedy, and that's quite a small community, isn't it? And then several years later, you're then placed into a different situation where you're not, not necessarily a member of the community, but you're thrown into
Absolutely
being
not. Uh,
assessing the perpetrator, Martin Bryant, who, for our listeners that might be a bit younger, who carried out the Port Arthur Massacre in Tasmania. And it was a horrific crime. I mean, I was actually living in Tasmania at the time. I grew up there. And yes, it was a crime that shocked the country and had huge, political fallout and changes. And you became involved in that, and you were asked quite early on to go and assess Martin Bryant.
Yeah, I mean, they got in touch with me within 24 hours, and I was probably less than 48 hours before I arrived in Tasmania to see him. They were still at that time removing the bodies, so it was that close. They had him in a special area. They'd closed off a whole area, one of the wings of the hospital. So he was alone in this, well, not alone, surrounded by
Mm,
police in this,
mm,
and essentially strapped to the bed. He'd received quite serious burns at the
mm.
final phase of the killing.
It's remarkable that you assessed him so quickly after the fact.
Yes,
Was yeah.
it helps. When I was in New Zealand, I used to try and assess homicide offenders I've been asked to be involved with as
Mm,
quickly as possible. In fact, it was so successful that the local bar made an objection to the prison authorities to make sure I didn't see them that quickly, because even if they had a lawyer present, they tended to say more than they should have done as far as their defence lawyers were concerned.
yeah. So Martin Bryant killed, if I've got this correct, 35 people, and I think around another 50 were injured, or so 50 maybe injured altogether, or was it another
Yeah.
50?
No, I think it was another. I mean, there were 35 dead. That
Yeah,
included two people he killed prior to starting the massacre. He killed a couple who lived
yeah.
nearby, and this was part of his plan, was to kill these two people and then go on to the massacre. And he, like all of these people, didn't expect to survive. He
Mm,
expected to die among his victims. And in fact, when he wasn't shot down, because he was armed with very high-powered weapons, and the unfortunate one policeman, tried to go up against him with a handgun, so that he
mm,
wasn't dead as he expected. So he returned to the house of the first two people he killed with the intention of setting the house on fire and going up in a literal blaze of glory. It's interesting. A number of these people have tried the same thing, to go
mm,
somewhere after the killing and set a building alight, so they die literally in the blaze, which in their mind is part of the glory. Uh, but Mr. Bryant did not have the courage to stay in the burning building and ran from it a light. The police
mm.
thought it might be someone escaping one of his hostages. There weren't any hostages, but the police thought there were, because the hostages, so-called, were dead. And they didn't shoot him down. They put the flames out, and he survived.
And one of the first things he said to you when you went to assess him was that I've got the record, which
That's
must
right.
have really shocked you.
Well, I'd expected to have trouble getting him to talk. I thought he would be frightened and overwhelmed by the whole situation. Who wouldn't be? So I arranged for someone who knew him, a social worker who'd had contact with him, to be present when I started the interview. But he wasn't at all phased, far from being anxious and unwilling to talk. He was more than happy to talk at great length to me. And one of the things he said very early on, with a little smile, was, "I've got the record, haven't I?" And I didn't need to ask him what the record was. I knew perfectly well what he preferred to. This was,
Mm.
at that point, no, he had killed more people in one of these events than anyone previously.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, often, that was a very different time as well. Today's landscape is very different with manifestos and social media footprints. And, there's a lot of widely available information on the person, but that wasn't so easy back in 1996. We often didn't know a lot about a perpetrator. What was your role in trying to understand his motivations? Were you able to unpack those?
Well, he provided a sort of combination. I mean, it wasn't the easiest to interview. He'd say something and then say, "Oh, that's not true," and then he'd talk about this and that. And he wasn't the brightest, so he wasn't particularly articulate. But listening to him, one gradually pieced together the stories from his point of view. Unfortunately, there was a lot of information about him. You grew up in Tasmania, everyone's got information. The problem is not what's not known, but is anything actually secret.
So there was quite a history there of stories to be told about him.
Well, the police gathered an immense amount of evidence. They did a superb job in terms of gathering background evidence. So there was no difficulty with accessing all this. And for example, no one tried to prevent uh, our access to his previous psychiatric records, far from it. So that wouldn't have happened in America. So, a lot of things made it relatively easy to gather a vast amount of information about this particular killer.
And what did you come to understand about why he carried out the attack?
I mean, he fits within the pattern, really. You've got to understand that these people go out to kill people in the expectation that they also will die among their victims. So the first thing you have to understand about it is it's an act of suicide. Well, almost every one of these events is an act of suicide. So the first thing you learned about Bryant was he intended to die. He thought about various ways of killing himself and decided on this. The second thing that Bryant is typical of is he was gun obsessed. He had a great collection of guns and no gun license, of course. Not having a gun license apparently in Tasmania increased the price of purchasing the weapon from a gun shop, but did not actually in any way impair it, even when you were buying. Some of the weapons he had were extraordinary. Fortunately, he didn't use most of them, but he certainly used a semi-automatic rifle. So the next thing is the gun obsessed. I mean, the other thing is he was an isolate, filled with resentment at the world. And resentment, remember, is a strange thing. Resentment isn't just having a grievance. We often use it loosely. Like, he's resentful about what happened. So we think about resentment sometimes in a very simplistic term. It's actually a very complex emotional state because it is a feeling that you've been mistreated in the past. You've been subjected to injustice, to humiliation, etc. But the second part is that at the time you did not respond. You did not stand up for yourself. You did not argue back. You just let the injustice occur without protesting. You let the humiliation occur without any effective response to that humiliation. And that's where the ongoing bitterness and the ongoing true resentment continues, because you keep reliving these experiences in your imagination, in your memory. They become a dominant theme, not just how I've been mistreated, but why did I not actually stand up for myself? So the next thing you see about these killings, and it makes perfect sense if you think about it, it is striking back at the world, and it is saying, I am not a weak wimp. I am a man of power. I am taking revenge. So in a sense, they're trying to make up for all those things that were done to them before. So that was typical of these kinds of killers. The other thing, of course, is that he planned it all in fantasy. So his fantasies, I mean, he's not the brightest man. He's just about literate. But that didn't mean that he hadn't learnt about, for example, he knew about the Texas university shooting. He knew about a number of the other shootings. So he had a model there. And he also had an obsession with some kind of, Rambo. You'd expect it. He had this identification with a sort of Rambo-like figure. So you have the fantasy, which goes before, which drives these things along.
And there was quite a bit of debate about his mental health and his various diagnoses. What clinical impressions did you form of him?
Well, he had no features of a major psychotic illness. Anyone can fit into a diagnosis of depression in this modern world. You just got to be not particularly happy with life. But in terms of any serious depression, anything that one would call a depressive illness, it simply wasn't there. One of the psychiatrists who examined him, I think perfectly reasonably, suggested that he might have Asperger's. This was in the days when we talked about Asperger's, not high-functioning autism. And I think that was a reasonable thing to suggest. But in fact, he doesn't have the history, nor the typical features of an Asperger. I mean, he certainly shared the lack of empathy and the difficulty of interacting with others, but that was about it. He was borderline subnormal or low functioning, whichever way you want, but he's on that little sort of borderline between intellectually disabled and low intellectual function. But despite that, he had certain sort of areas of talent, etc. So, from a mental health perspective, he had nothing that was of relevance to a defence of diminished, and really nothing in there which could be used effectively, in my view, in mitigation. I mean, you couldn't say that this man was a profoundly depressed man who was unable to cope because he was intellectually disabled. I mean, there was the other strange thing about him. He was a millionaire. He had grown up, ordinary family, nothing special about the family. Dad was a tradesman, I think. He'd not been able to obtain a job because, quite honestly, he was incapable of doing outside work. He didn't have and so his father had got him a little sort of job around the place, doing a bit of gardening here, a bit of mowing there. And he was I think he was on an invalid pension or unemployment. I can't remember what. I think it was an invalid pension, probably for intellectual reasons. And then he met this woman, Mrs. Harvey, who was the heiress to a massive fortune, well, part of a massive fortune, which she inherited from Australia's largest bookmaker. So became very attached to her. She became very attached. She was an odd woman. I never met her, so I won't make a diagnosis, but clearly she was not psychiatrically normal. Exactly what abnormality she had, I don't know. But anyway, he was her ideal son, the one she never had, the child she could indulge. And he was, you see, you look at Bryant at that stage, this was a few years before the killing. I mean, he's a very attractive looking man. You know, he's blonde haired, he has a childlike demeanour, a childlike appearance, an attractive child. And so she took him on as her attractive child and indulged him in everything. And he's essentially, he and Ms. Harvey formed a happy little couple, living out the fantasy of him as the constantly indulged child and her as the totally satisfied mother. Then she was killed. She was killed in an accident, he was injured in it as well. So there was a lot of talk about him having responsible for the accident. It's nonsense. She used to drive around in a car full of dogs, with none of them restrained. That's what caused the accident. And he inherited her fortune. So overnight, he was a man with no money, other than a little few dollars he earned and his small pension. He became a millionaire. And that, of course, he expected to change his life. And people would start talking to him. People would want to know him. People wouldn't humiliate him anymore. People wouldn't laugh at him. Well, yes and no. Certainly people gathered around him very quickly to try and get some of the money that leaked around the edges of his new lifestyle. But in fact, he had no more success finding friends than ever before. And he wasn't so stupid. He had a sort of insight to some extent into people, certainly enough to realise very quickly when people were not interested in him but interested in his money. And this made things worse than they'd ever been before. Now, despite being wealthy and despite having all this largesse at his disposal, people still humiliated him, still didn't understand him, still didn't accept him, etc. So in a very strange way, becoming a millionaire made his sense of resentment even greater.
So there was a real lack of belonging there for him, a sense of hopelessness as well, and he collected injustices, as you were
That's
saying, and
right.
it seems that the violence was about, in some ways, a form of psychological need restoration. In some ways, making up
It
for
was.
all the things that lacked for him.
It was. It was the
Mm,
ultimate expression of resentment. And in
mm,
his mind, because he'd read about these things before, he had this fantasy that he would suddenly be seen as a powerful, even if evil force. And the other thing he thought is he would become famous. And he was right. I mean, and that's one of the tragedies, that he became an inspiration for multiple attempts to imitate him, just as the Texas University massacre had become a model for those who went after. Which is
mm,
why in the book I don't try not to mention names, because I don't
mm,
want to give these people any fame. Not because it's going to make any difference to them; they're already famous. You know,
mm,
Martin has over 1 million hits on the name on the internet. So it doesn't make any difference not mentioning his name because everyone knows who he was.
mm,
Um, but given that fame is one of the things that those who are planning these massacres see as the benefits of carrying them out, is that they will become famous. If they
mm,
realize that their name will never be mentioned, that the only thing that will be mentioned is where it happened, maybe the names of victims, but they will remain anonymous. If we could get to
mm,
that stage, persuade the press and the media to do that, I think it would remove one of the stimuluses to committing these terrible acts.
mm. It's interesting looking back at the Port Arthur Massacre because in some ways, even though it was so many decades ago, the functionality of Bryant's behaviour just bears so many similarities to the functionality of all the current mass casualty or lone actors that we see. So it really hasn't evolved in many ways. I guess we've had a period there where we became very consumed by the ideological aspect, and that certainly has a role to play. But I still go back to the general sort of foundational aspects that's driving the violence rather than always getting caught up in the ideologies in it. And it often is quite universal across perpetrators.
Yeah, that's right. And it's imitation.
Mm,
I mean, it is wanting to be what the previous mass killers have become,
mm,
and it's also, you see, it's now a script for suicide, uh,
mm.
uh, an extraordinarily powerful script for suicide.
I want to take a brief pause in the show now to introduce my new book, Mass Casualty, The Rise of Lone Actors. Now, I've spent 4 years working on this book and I would love to share it with you. If you're like me and concerned by the rise in mass casualty violence, then this book is an important read. In the book, I explore numerous cases, unpack motivations, scrutinize ideologies, and examine why grievances are now leading to violence. On top of analyzing the many pathways to violence, I take a deep dive into what can be done to stop these tragedies and address the need for prevention. We look at the role of threat teams, risk assessment, and even what we need from media and from government. I hope the book can help educate people and create greater awareness around this tragic form of violence. It's out now, and like all good books, the easiest place for our international audiences to find the book is on Amazon. Now, let's jump back to today's episode.
For those consumed by resentment, those who are gun lovers. I mean, you don't have to be gun obsessed to commit these massacres, but it does help.
Mm,
And that's a feature which goes across almost all of them, not just the American one. Uh,
mm, mm,
so that the collecting of guns, the obsession with guns, that is part of the contributing factors to these massacres. It's some people put it down entirely to the guns, and it's not. I mean, one of the arguments that it's the guns is that after the gun buyback, which followed the Tasmanian massacre, which was such an important event within Australia, that we stopped being the country with high rates of these events to being a country with a very, very low rate of these events, which has continued. I mean, the guns are creeping back in Australia, unfortunately, but it was an important thing and a lot of lives were saved by removing the guns from the hands, from the population, and re-establishing the notion within law that to have a gun was a privilege, not a right, it was a privilege. And that was so important in flipping what was happening in Australia and New Zealand, that it was a right to have a gun, just like America. And that ended it. The other extraordinarily important thing in Australia and New Zealand, Australia particularly, was that the people who followed on from who imitated the Tasmania massacre in Australia, almost all of them survived. They were captured. I mean, it's extraordinary. We are the only country where the majority of those who after Port Arthur, who attempted these massacres, were captured, not killed. And that, I think, was almost more important than the guns. It was at least as important as the guns. Because instead of having a model of exit stage left, big blaze of glory, become famous, you have a model captured, humiliated, exposed, humiliated. That's not a good way of resolving your resentment. So the model was shifted slightly for Australia. I fear that the old model will come back slowly, but we hope not. The guns was important. Survival of these men was very important. If we go back to where this story, in a sense, starts, in Malaysia, in that whole archipelago around there, the British colonial administration virtually brought Amok to a stop. Amok was so common in that region that it was almost a weekly event. It was certainly a monthly event.
Wow.
And these things were extraordinarily common. And what the administration did, given some advice, and there were actually a number of psychiatrists who wrote, or medical practitioners who wrote about it at the time, was to keep them alive. They want to die? Well, let them die. They're not going to go out having restored prestige and had their revenge and become a powerful figure. We're going to keep them alive. And they issued the police with special instruments to capture these people. So they captured it. And they did what was utterly humiliating for someone in those cultures. They put them in a psychiatric hospital. Okay, they did not convict them of murder. They certainly didn't execute them. They put them into a psychiatric unit. That psychiatric unit existed until relatively recently, unchanged. I visited it 15 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. Extraordinary. And that's where they went. As soon as that became common knowledge within the communities that you didn't die, you finished up in what was the worst possible and most humiliating end, locked up in a psychiatric unit, it stopped. Or at least became a very rare event, having been a very common event. And that's another important message. This is one of the reasons that Amok comes into the title, because Amok was an epidemic of this kind of killing, much greater epidemic than we're facing at the moment in the West, and it was stopped.
Australia and New Zealand obviously had a really good run throughout the 90s, the early 2000s, and then we hit 2014 and the landscape seemed to change. There was the Link Cafe siege, and I can't remember the other incident.
Yeah,
that was
but
a
got to
couple
remember
of
the Link
months.
Cafe siege really wasn't it was a different kind of phenomenon.
It was, but it sort of marked the point where we started to see a gradual rise or a more frequent occurrence in these types of targeted attacks that were either ideological or grievance or fixation based, and they moved towards targeting the public in a way to make a statement for around their grievance or for around the ideology, and that it really seemed to be a shifting point in the landscape. And certainly, again, different policing resources, different roles were created across the various government departments, counter-terrorism funding. So we saw a big change around then. Would you say that's sort of an accurate assessment that from around then a lot has changed across Australia and New Zealand?
I think it has, and I think we've got to remember the guns are back.
Yes.
The government policy has allowed a gradual creep back of guns, and that is a disaster.
Mm.
Um, I think, and you've got to remember that. Are we seeing more? I mean, we've seen some terrible things more recently, and the ideological has always been in part present within these things. Not when we look at the Tasmanian killing, there's no articulated ideology there. But if we look at many of the others, or some of the others, there most certainly is, usually either a right wing. If we look at the Aramoana killer, he had gone from a sort of hippie lefty to, well, a neo-Nazi, clear as that. And a number of the other killers of these killers have gone into the extreme right-wing sort of positions. And some of them have used racist or anti-feminist. I mean, there have been several massacres where the motivation is anti-feminist.
Mm.
The incel massacres, as you know about. So
Mm.
the ideology begins to come into it as part of why I'm a hero as well. Not only am I courageous, not only am I no longer to be humiliated, but I'm also a hero of incel, a hero of the fight for liberation of this, that, or t'other, a fight against the hidden state. So you get this mixture of religious and right wing and occasionally loony left wing ideas being drawn in to this. So it now adds to the model. It gives flavour to it. I don't think it explains it. Many of
Mm.
these people, for example, I can't remember which one it was, the man who committed a massacre in a nightclub in America. And when interviewed, he'd said he was doing it for Islam, that he was a supporter of Hamas, and he was a supporter of. He managed to say he was a supporter of two totally opposed Muslim
Mm.
activist groups. Um,
Mm.
so
Omar Mateen, I think it was.
yes,
Mm.
that's right.
Mm.
I mean, so okay, so but that's not ideology.
Mm.
That's
Mm.
That's an excuse. That's a thing just to give yourself a little bit of a make you look an intellectual when you can't tell the difference between two terms. It's like saying you did it for the Pope when you were actually a sort of fundamentalist Protestant.
Yeah, it's this as the term that's being coined is that salad bar ideology or just an
Yes,
array of cherry picked beliefs.
I had heard that. I like that,
Mm.
and it's very important. I mean, that's
It is.
absolutely right. It is
Yeah.
salad bar. I mean, because what's
Yeah.
driving them is themselves. It's about them. Not
Mm.
about,
Mm.
furthering a cause. It's about them.
Absolutely, yeah, and we touched before on the Link Cafe siege, and one of the big recommendations out of that was the need for fixated threat assessment centres in Australia. Now, Queensland already had one in 2013, and
Yeah.
and it had been
Self-pathology.
and it had been developed as well over in the UK by David James and some of his colleagues over there in 2006. But that's become a really important part of the landscape for policing and mental health for preventing this form of violence. But some of our listeners might not know or be aware of your role that predated that with some of your colleagues that with the Fixated Research Group. Are you able to talk us through that and what you pioneered? Because it is really quite critical to the role of fixated threat assessments these
Yeah.
days.
I mean, it has a strange history. The British Home Office, that's responsible for royal security, was paying out vast sums of money to protect a wide spectrum of the royal family. And their problem was they didn't know, or they didn't feel confident in saying, we don't need to provide 24 hours, 7 days a week coverage for this person or that person, but we do for this person. So they felt that they needed a better way of assessing the risks. And many of these people that they were worried about were stalkers. I mean, in fact, all of them were stalkers. So they decided that they would try and get some experts on stalking to do some research, find out how the best way to approach protecting a wide range of people, but doing a proper assessment so that you didn't have to spend money every time a little anxiety was raised. So, I mean, what was really motivating, well, let's be honest, they weren't going to improve royal security, i.e. the Queen's security, but they wanted to make the provision of security for the wider family a lot cheaper. A lot cheaper. It's costing vast amounts of money. Anyway, so they put out this contract, and David James, who I knew very well, and Frank Farnham, they contacted me, and then I contacted Michelle, and we became part of this research group, so that we were given remarkable access to all of the records of people who stalked, particularly the Queen, and other members of the royal family. And essentially whatever we asked for, psychiatric records, criminal records, anything, we got. So we had this vast thing. And one of the things, we all were very clear what we were going to find. If you're anyone who thinks researchers don't know the answer before they do the research, that doesn't know much about researchers. I mean, unfortunately, the answer you start off with may not be the answer you get. And you have to live with that. And maybe that's the best thing about research. So we had an answer before we started because it was based on our experience of stalkers in the community. And we had lots of experience of that. We'd done studies. It was going to be the same, but it wasn't. It was totally different. So what we found was that a high proportion of the persistent stalkers had mental illness. An even higher proportion of those who tried to launch attacks or break through cordons, etc., had a mental illness. A severe, we're not talking now about a touch of depression or a so-called personality disorder. We're talking about psychosis. And most of those people, at the time they became a problem for security, were out of touch with the mental health services. Most of them have been in contact with the mental health services, but now are out of contact with the mental health services. So what we found was that what appeared to be a problem of security was actually a mental health problem. And you could convert it into a mental health problem, but you could only do that if you had the police and mental health people working together. The other thing we found was what we termed fixation, which was, and that's sometimes based in mental illness, sometimes based in slightly more nebulous psychopathology than clear psychosis. And it was a matter of how you manage these people. In many ways, managing them was easier than managing people in the community, where there's a very, very low level of severe mental illness among stalkers, very low. So having a mental health solution to stalkers in the community is not going to make much difference. I mean, it plays a small part, but only a small part. Here, it played a major part. So it was a matter of setting up a system which could encompass both the security, police angle and the mental health angle. A lot of the early work, once the system was set up, was persuading psychiatrists. They have the advantage of the NHS. Everyone in Britain has, in theory, a GP, and in theory, there's a psychiatrist who is responsible for them in a very broad sense. They live in a particular area. A psychiatrist has responsibility for everyone in that area. Persuading the psychiatrist sometimes to actually take their responsibility seriously was not easy, but it does help when you have the power of the government and the power of royal security behind you. So that's set up. And one of the things that was very important was not just the doing in this area, but it also led to the setting up of joint police mental health professionals to deal with stalking in the community, not on the grounds that there were likely to be high levels of mental illness, but on the grounds that managing this situation, both the victims and the perpetrators did have an element where the mental health professionals could provide some assistance in the management of stalking. So that's extraordinary. It's the easiest research project I've ever done. You just asked for something and it happened. You had to get ethical consent. It sometimes took them as much as 2 days to give us ethical consent for something we've asked for.
Wow. And so that set up
The other strange thing about it is that almost everyone involved in it were Republicans. In fact, strong Republicans. David James, Frank Farnham, myself are all very strong Republicans. But that doesn't matter because it was a medical problem. It was a technical problem. And it was a good research thing. So it had implications way beyond queens and kings and princelings and princesses, which was great.
Well, it's had huge lasting implications and huge reach as well, hasn't it? So it now has
amazing.
Yeah,
totally
it's now
surprising.
It's moved past just fixation as well, hasn't it? And it's taken on grievances as well.
Yes, and it's also taken on, of course, terrorism. Of course, most of the terrorist threat is not from well-organized militants. It's from the hangers-on. It's from those who have been radicalized on the internet. It's from those who are looking for some way of making sense of their miserable adolescent lives. And they don't have enough people telling them, don't worry about it, mate. Adolescence is very difficult. It's better. Or worse. So it has had very wide applications.
You raise a really good point around the terrorism, though. I think we've gone through this cycle where there's the temptation to classify things as terrorism or not terrorism. And, we've had, depending on what figures you take, roughly around 17 terrorism offences across Australia and New Zealand since 2014. But then we get other cases that are mental illness based, like the Bondi Junction attack. And then, of course, there's other instances that are not classified as terrorism, such as the Burke Street attack in Melbourne by James Gargastoulis. And it becomes a little bit complex and confusing trying to work out which should go into which basket or which category. Should we be instead just conceptualizing it more so as lone actor, grievance-fuelled violence?
The difficulty is the law. The law has created this extraordinary framework around the prosecution and management of what is being called terrorism. So that a terrorism conviction brings with it extraordinary outcomes. I mean, one of the people I was involved with assessing, in fact, for the Crown, was a young man who'd been caught up in this thing. I mean, he had an interesting psychotic illness. We can call it schizophrenic, but it was an atypical schizophrenia. But getting this man out of prison was almost impossible. I mean, he was on various orders of a lengthy detention on safety grounds when he'd actually never committed or been involved in any kind of terrorist action. And the only terrorist action in him was his mouth. He was mouthy. And he learned quite early on that if you really wanted people's attention, he said you were going to fight for the liberation of the Arab world by bombing something or blowing something up, or I'll have you to the policeman killed because you're a threat. So he was really good with terrorist infused threats. There was nothing there. There was nothing there, but that's got him stuck. That's not the only one. So I don't think, from a mental health point of view and from a criminological point of view, it's very important to do exactly what you said, try and sort these things out. From a legal point of view, it's going to be a nightmare to actually walk back the vast amount of legislation which has been thrown up in response to what is in reality a relatively low-level threat to human life and safety.
Mm. You raise a really good point around that, though, because we've have, particularly in Australia, the terrorism legislation looking at continuing detention orders for offenders. It really stipulates that a person needs to have a risk assessment that says that they are at an ongoing risk or threat to the community, and then there's been a lot of argument around, are we actually able to assess terrorism recidivism, because the base rates of reoffending for terrorists are so low. So it creates a really difficult dilemma, because arguably those tools, the risk assessment tools around violent extremism, could be quite useful, but we're trying to match them up with terrorism laws and legislation that they actually probably weren't developed for.
That's right. And the difficulty with, it's like trying to predict reoffending in sexual offenders. It's dead easy if the person's got 3, 4, 5 convictions. You would say, they're probably going to do it again if you've got any chance. But when it's their first offence, you've got a reoffence rate which is less than 14%. Any risk assessment tool is going to flounder and overpredict, grossly overpredict. The difficulty we have with most of our assessment tools is when it comes to any kind of violence, any kind of criminality, they over predict. The other thing is the psychology of the psychologist or the psychiatrist doing the assessment. If you say there's a risk, nothing happens, no one blames you. Well, if you say there's a very high risk and nothing happens, no one blames you. You say there's a low risk and they reoffend, then you are in the shit. That is such a motivation, never to say someone is at low risk.
Yeah, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, aren't you, in many respects?
Well, unfortunately not. Predict high risk, you're not damned. That's fine.
Well,
can't go wrong.
you're safe, even though you could be wrong.
You're probably wrong. Almost certainly wrong. No matter.
Yeah.
No, you're never going to be held to account for that. But get
Yes.
it the other way, you certainly are. So, it's damned if you don't, if you predict a risk which is high or higher than normal.
That's interesting, the prediction aspect, because that's with the FTAC model, it's certainly moved towards trying to triage, and look, some of that will be over predicting. Anyone that's moderate or medium risk and above gets a high level of intervention and support and wraparound responses, which I think is great, because that's that public health model, a bit like treating heart disease, where we go, okay, there's elevations, there's baseline factors here that raise concerns, and now we're going to treat that, and it takes the challenge away from trying to predict which will be the outlier or which is the needle in the haystack that we have to find. So I think if it leans more towards buffering the fact that those predictions could be wrong, but we're putting the support and the intervention in place, then that would hopefully be some level of reassurance that at least we're trying to do something about it.
Couldn't agree more. As long as you're doing assessments to help people, but that's what the FTAC thing is supposed to be about. And I think it is mostly. The trouble is when you get to the courts, and the courts ask for risk assessments when they're thinking of sentencing or releasing, then you're into a very different area. I think you need a much higher level of certainty before you use a risk assessment to imprison someone or to extend the imprisonment of someone. I don't think you need to get too fussed about errors when all what you're doing is helping them. They've got problems, you're helping them with problems. The problems may not have led to anything, but you're helping them with problems. So from a health professional's point of view, go for it. But when saying in court is finishing up with people locked in prison, I don't know sometimes whether the people making these reports have got any idea of the utter misery that being a prisoner brings. then I have real problems.
Do you have advice for our practitioners out there today that, are working in the field and as we touched on, the salad bar extremism that is out there now, we've got this weird intermingling of ideologies, grievances, fixations. There's so much noise and complexity. How do you go about separating the wheat from the chaff to make sense of these fellows?
It's okay. Psychologists, psychiatrists, we're clinicians, for God's sake. We focus on the person in front of us. We focus on them, their life, their ideas. I mean, we're not there to sort out the complexities of the world. We're there to try and help the person sitting opposite us.
Yeah. So the advice would be to go back to the person and understand the person and the function of the violence for them, because what I find is we more and more are getting caught in the noise. We're caught in the top layers and we're missing that there's actually a person there, and there's been a range of contributing factors that have led to them, getting into the noise, getting into the layers.
I think one of the biggest problems we now face when confronting the individual is that we have now had decades of the internet. We've had decades of various kinds of ideas and group forming and reinforcing sometimes silly, sometimes important ideas. We now have a generations coming up who've lived a significant part of their lives in vivid fantasy created for them, not their fantasies. But not just the video games, but all those other things. And I think we are beginning to see more and more people where the violence is the acting out of a fantasy world that they've created, independent of the reality in which they live, and to a large extent, independent of their reality. So that you have a sort of almost in parallel person, the person who lives in a and comes in and out of a fantasy world, and the other person. And the two can move. The fantasy world can move you violently into the real world without you really understanding or really being inhibited by the move across that boundary between what you fantasize about and what you do. And on a number of occasions, we've caught people on the way to terrible, violent acts, caught up in a fantasy world which these things make sense within, and confronting them with that jump, making them suddenly realize that you're taking it seriously. This is real. You, the therapist, are taking it seriously. You, the person interviewing them, are taking it seriously. Sometimes suddenly does help to erect the barrier again between the fantasy and reality, which was about to lead them to total chaos.
I mean, that's a fantastic point. I've got probably really, one more question to ask you, and it probably is it's extending on that. I think it's, where are we going and what do we do? Because I mean, I look in the last couple of weeks, obviously there's been the assassination of Charlie Kirk over in the US. The other day, the USA had 6 mass shootings in 24 hours, which was just, it's I don't even know how he put that into words. And then as we record this today, there's been a mass casualty attack over in the UK at a synagogue as well. It just seems as though we are hitting a real pinnacle at the moment, where it's actually seems to be in some ways accelerating, and there's greater greater numbers of people moving towards violence. And as you said, that fantasy aspect really seems to be culminating at the moment, particularly copycat and contagion effects as well. So where do we go? Where do you see this heading? And is there an endpoint, or have we still got some challenging times ahead?
I think we've got to look at it in the wider context. In most countries, including America, including Australia, including New Zealand, the murder rate's going down. Been going down quite a while. So overall, we are facing a society where less people are seriously damaged and killed Well, it could be, of course, it's improved medical care, which is accounted for the drop in, some of the drop in homicide. But we're also at the same time seeing generations coming up whose experience of growing up, whose experience of the world has been totally different from anyone previously. A world in which directed fantasy has been a significant part in their growing up. And we're just going to have to find out. I mean, I think the first thing is there's no way we're going to stop that now. That is the reality which our children and our grandchildren, or in my case, our great-grandchildren, are going to grow up in. And we've got to find a way to help them not be destroyed by it.
I think that's a very good point to finish up on. Paul, I just want to, for all our listeners, just to thank you for your time today, but to let our listeners know as well, just to reiterate, your new book is now available, Running Amok, Inside the Mind of the Lone Mass Killer. And I imagine it's available on all major platforms, but often Amazon's the easiest place now for people to buy books.
And at the moment, it's probably the only way to get it quickly in Australia and New Zealand is as an ebook.
Yes,
Unless
wonderful.
From Amazon UK and get it delivered.
Okay. Yes. So definitely, otherwise Amazon UK if you're after the hard copy.
I think so. I mean, I don't know. I don't understand publishing, so I just know it's bloody hard, as you know too, to get something published.
Yes, it's a thankless task, I think. So, look, I want to really, again, just thank you for your time today. And you've been long time retired now, but you're still very much active in I think tracking and following the trends and the current landscape. So it's great to have you publishing another piece of work.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you for listening to the Targeted Violence podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please support the show by subscribing. Stay tuned for more episodes.